Hi everyone, in this video I'm going to be sharing with you my 5 essential acrylic supplies. Now the great thing about these supplies is you do not have to have a huge budget, but the really good thing is that all of these supplies that I'm going to share with you are really good quality. So we can do all of this and have archival artwork that's going to last for many years and not have to spend a small fortune. So my first essential supply is the surface. Now the surface that we're painting on can really affect the results that we get. Sometimes if you're new to starting off with a medium, regardless of what it is, the techniques that we're using may not be working, and then we might have a lot of self-doubt that it's just our ability and we can't do it. But quite often it's the supplies that we're using are not allowing for those techniques. Now, of course, there is also the option to use pre-stretched canvases, but as those are more expensive, I do find that especially when we're new to a medium and we're starting out, that we might not potentially experiment with that medium and learn from it as much as when using a canvas board, because we're holding back because we don't want to ruin or make a mistake on more of an expensive surface. So that's another reason why a canvas board for me is the perfect option. One last thing that I would like to mention before I move on to my second essential supply is I do usually like to work with a smoother surface. So what I will do is I'll put another coat of gesso. I have a photo in the corner of the one that I use, and I will apply that to my surface, wait for it to dry, and then lightly sand that. I will repeat that process 2 or 3 times until I've got the canvas board or my pre-stretched canvas the right level of smoothness that I personally like. Now there are a few brands that I do like to use. The one here that I've done the red squirrel on is a Winsor & Newton canvas board. Now these are the ones that I have used the most, and so far I've not had any issues with them warping. So the other brand of canvas boards here that I have and I've tried and I really do love them is the Clairefontaine. Now I stumbled across these accidentally when I was ordering some pastel supplies, and I thought I'd give them a go. Now I only ever recommend supplies that I have tested myself, and I've had no issues with these warping either. And the reason why I do like these is, as you can see, you get a couple of extra options. A round canvas can make a real difference to certain reference photos, and having the ability of a square as well just means that you have more options. So these and the Winsor & Newton are my 2 brands of choice. So my second essential supply is of course the paints. Now these here, there are many different colours that you can get in so many of the brands that are on offer. It can get very overwhelming. But for anybody starting out, the biggest thing that I would recommend is to just limit your colour palette. Make it easier by only having potentially 5 colours on that palette. So start off with your primary colours. So you want your blue, red and yellow. You can mix any colour pretty much from those 3 colours. And then I would recommend a black and a white so that you can then darken that colour or lighten that colour. That's a really good place to start. So Liquitex Basics are my brand of choice. Now for me, there are a couple of reasons why. I like working with glazes to adjust my colour. That's one of the main reasons why I like this brand, because quite a lot of the colours are more transparent and therefore are better suited for glazing. Now with that being said, Liquitex Basics are also one of the cheaper brands, but don't let that put you off. They are still exceptional quality. One huge bonus to Liquitex Basics for me is that most of the colours are rated highly on the light fast scale. Now that means that they're not prone to fading or discoloration when exposed to light. Now I don't want to go too much into light fast because that's something that is required for a whole separate tutorial. But light fast ratings for me is really important. I don't want my artwork to fade over time. Now, of course, it's going to be, you want that person, whoever buys your art, to care for it properly. But I want to make sure that the materials, the surface, the colours that I am using are already of that standard. So that then once I know that they are being framed and positioned, placed in that home in the right conditions, that they should last and look the same the day that I painted it compared to many years down the line. So my next essential supply is the brushes. Now I'm personally not as fussy about which brushes I use as what I am compared to the surface and the paints. I do find that generic brands work really well. Now my favourite brand that out of all of those I think would be the Daler & Rowney, and I use these a lot. These ones here I use more for the first few base layers, and there are a certain few shapes of brushes that I would recommend to get. So to start with, you can't go wrong with your standard round brushes. So these here, I do have a couple of different sizes, and I do like to have these two options. Now you'll notice here that the selection of brushes I've got, except in these ones over here, most of the sizes I have are fairly small. And for me, I like to get my base layers fairly accurate early on. I don't want to put one solid colour down because I do think it's then harder for us to follow our reference photo. Now again, this is something that I do go in depth in my slower tutorials on Patreon. But the round brushes here, because they don't have that solid edge at the end, they're really good for creating fur. So next up would be a filbert brush. These I really do like for natural brush strokes because you don't get those harsh start and stop points that the flat brush on the left can create. Now the main difference between these is, as you can see, a filbert brush is curved at the top and a flat brush, as the name would suggest, is flat across there. So you are going to end up with harsher lines with this brush. So for that reason, I don't ever really use these in my work. But the filberts I do, and again I like to have a couple of different sizes, some smaller ones and then some medium sized ones. Now if you do like working with larger brushes, then of course that's absolutely fine. You just may have to add another couple of larger sizes to your sets. So next up is the liner or rigger brushes. Now as you can see, there are a few that you can get, and the brands I've found, I'm not quite as picky, but I do seem to go more towards the Daler and Rowney. I just like how soft the bristles are. But Winsor & Newton, which is this one here, would also work. I just find that it's a little bit firmer. So for me, I don't have as much of that softer movement that I personally like when painting longer whiskers. So that's why I do still always buy the Daler and Rowney brand rather than anything else. But as I've said, I would just recommend having a couple of different sizes. These shorter liner brushes work really well for finer details and the smaller whiskers, maybe tiny little eyelashes, whereas the longer, bigger sizes work really well for whiskers. Some big cats, lions, tigers, leopards, they have really long whiskers, and also ones that are a little bit thicker. Whiskers are going to vary quite a lot depending on the subject. So having a couple of different size options of your liner and rigger brushes means that you are better equipped for how thick and how long that line needs to be. Okay, so next up are brushes that I've only recently started using within the last few months, and I absolutely love them. This is a rake brush. Now they're also called grass comb brushes depending on where you buy them from. But there are a couple of options with these as well, and ones that I would say are better than others. So I'm going to try and see if my camera can focus up close to these. Now you can see just how different these look. The last section of the bristles almost look like it's been graduated. So what these do is they actually paint a selection of lines rather than one line at a time. So this means that they can paint fur texture really well. They can block in that first layer of texture far quicker than if we were using a liner brush and painting in each individual hair. So the rake brushes here, as I've said, there are a couple of things that I would consider when buying them based on what I now currently know. So this here was the one that I was using, and as you can see, it's a flat shaped brush. Just like the previous brushes I showed you, this has a tendency to create harsher start and stop points because you've got that harsh edge. Whereas this brush here is a rake brush, but it's a filbert shaped, so it's curved on both sides. This here means it really does create far more natural brush strokes. Now the one thing that I have found when using these brushes, it really does vary depending on the amount of consistency of that paint. So how much water you've got versus paint, and also how you're holding that brush. I have specific videos on Patreon showing you how to use these brushes in order to create very realistic fur. I also have the time-lapse versions here on YouTube, and you see those brushes in action. I have it on the red squirrel as well. So next up are the blending brushes. Now, if you're not blending large areas, these aren't essential, but if you do want to be working on backgrounds, I would recommend these sorts of brushes. Now the ones that I have tried which are for artists are by Daler and Rowney, and this is the only time I've found that I didn't like one of their brushes. Now, although this is called a round mop, it's intended for blending larger areas. I find that these shed their bristles so much, and it's really frustrating. You can be blending out a background, the bristles will come out and then get stuck to that wet paint. You've then got to use another paintbrush or some tweezers to gently prise that bristle off the background. You then end up with some indentations or marks, which you then have to soften out, and again, more bristles can then shed from that brush. So it is a vicious cycle. What I have found is by using some makeup brushes, these are just standard blush brushes, that these don't lose their bristles at all. I've not had any issues with them shedding, and I have tried quite a few brands, and again, I've not had any issues. So if you're looking to blend large areas of your acrylics, I would recommend the makeup brushes rather than the ones that are intended for artists. Now, as I've said, I haven't tried all of the ones for artists, so I'm sure there are ones out there that don't drop their bristles. But for me, I really don't want to be buying loads of different brushes and finding that some of them do that still. So for me, because I've never had an issue with these are the ones that I would recommend. Okay, so next up are the palettes. Now this is just going to be something that I do find is going to be more personal preference. I hate washing up. I don't want to be scraping any paint off after the painting session. I really don't want to mess about with that. So for me, I do prefer using the disposable palettes, and they really are so versatile. You can just cut off the amount that you want depending on how big your painting is going to be and how much of that space you think you might need. And then simply when you're finished with it, you can just throw it away. So this is certainly my preference. Now, if you don't like to use these and you don't maybe want to go in and buy some more expensive palettes, I do know people that just use a little bit of like tin foil, and that can also work. I personally don't like to use that myself because it can be harder to judge your values and your colours when you're fighting against the silver shiny layer of that foil. So these palettes last a long time. Normally for my Patreon tutorials, I will cut them in half, and one bit on each half will do me for one painting. So for instance, with this red squirrel, usually I would only actually use half of this size. So these would certainly be my preference, but again, the only reason why I've chosen with these is because I don't want to be washing up. I do also know other people that use glass, so you can use an old picture frame, and the glass there, you can just scrape that off, but of course you just got to be extra careful that that doesn't break, and then obviously you don't cut yourself. But these are my preference. So I have added this to this video because for me this is an essential item that I do use when I want my paints to stay wetter for longer, or if I'm blending out a larger area. You may have often heard me speak about a fine mist sprayer bottle on my YouTube tutorials, and this is something that I show how to use in depth in my Patreon versions. Now with this, as the name suggests, this is very different to a standard spray bottle. This being able that it can put a fine layer of water over the top and that fine mist means that you don't end up with heavier, bigger water droplets, which will cause a problem when you're trying to get that smooth blending. The fine mist sprayer bottle, if you do struggle with the faster drying time of acrylics, you can put that paint on your surface, you can lightly spray over the top, make sure it is a light layer, and then that will help to keep that paint wet for as long as you need. If you feel that it's starting to dry, again apply another layer of water. You can, by doing this technique, make acrylics give you the same results as oils. That paint will only dry at the speed that you dictate. So if you keep on applying a layer of water over the top, when you notice that it's just starting to dry and starting to evaporate, that will help to keep that acrylic paint wetter for longer. And as I've said, this is perfect for trying to blend smooth backgrounds. Another part of any painting process which is really important is the varnish that we use. Now for me, I've always used the Winsor & Newton gloss varnish. I really do like this, but I do make sure it's the professional one. They do a couple of others. They are as well, they come with a different coloured label across the front. So as long as you make sure it's got the white label, this is the one that I use. Now, I haven't made the varnishing here a separate point in the essential video that I've just created here. Instead, I'm going to add it into this last miscellaneous group because I've got one other item coming up next which can be really handy. Now, the reason why I haven't put this in its own category is because there are so many varnishes to choose from. It does, again, come down to the artist's personal preference. I like to have a spray varnish rather than one that you pour on and then put over with a paintbrush. I don't potentially like how you can end up with some of the brush streak marks across the painting. So for me, the spray works really well. You want to make sure that you do a nice even coat. I personally like to do it in all 4 directions. So I go from left to right, right to left, and then up, down, and then again top to bottom. So that is exactly how I like to varnish, to make sure that I get a really nice layer over the top. You really want to make sure that it's completely dry before you package it up. I usually will put these away for a week in a room that they can just be set aside. They're safe, they're not going to get anything, they're not going to get damaged, but they are going to be allowed to completely dry. Now, the one last item here that I just want to quickly mention that I nearly forgot about is a General's white charcoal pencil. Now, I have lots of videos on Patreon showing you how you can get your outline on your surface, and if you do that and then you realise you've forgotten a part of that outline and you need to freehand it in, I would recommend to use a General's white charcoal pencil rather than a standard graphite pencil, because with this you're going to be able to easily cover it up with the paint. Whereas with graphite, because it's got a bit of a shine to it, the acrylic can sometimes have some of that graphite show through, and you really don't want that. The last thing we want is to have our outline visible through all the lovely fur detail that we build up. So this is just something, and they're fairly inexpensive. I think you can pick them up for like £1.50, £2 per pencil, and they last a long time if you're only using it to transfer and sketch some of your outline on your painting. So yeah, this is just the one last thing that is just handy to use. I've had one pencil of this and it's lasted me nearly 3 years. So I would recommend, if you do like to freehand things directly onto your canvas, then this pencil is ideal. So I'll just show you quickly this golden retriever painting that I did for a Patreon tutorial a couple of months ago, and I used the fine mist sprayer bottle on the background section so that I could get this really nice mottled but soft effect. Now all of this was done with traditional brushwork and using that fine mist sprayer bottle to keep my paint wetter for longer, so that I can then use my makeup brushes to then soften out my edges. I also used that same technique on the fur on the edges where I wanted this to look a little softer and a little bit out of focus. Earlier on in the video, you saw a little section in the corner showing you what type of brush strokes the rake brush can do, and this is the finished painting. Now this again is also available on my Patreon channel as a full-length tutorial. I do have a Patreon library on my website which lists all of the tutorials that are immediately available as soon as you sign up. You do of course get the reference photo, line art and full material list, so you know every single brush, all of the colours that I have used. So if that's of interest, I will make sure that the Patreon library and my Patreon channel are linked in the description below. So I really hope this video has been useful. If it was, I would really appreciate it if you could give the video a like and a thumbs up, because it makes a real difference. And if you would like to get notified of future content and you don't miss the 3 videos each week that I upload here to YouTube, then hit the subscribe and the bell button. As always, thank you so much for watching.